In this video, I want to offer a quick rebuttal to a way to defend biblical inerrancy against an apparent defeater or an objection. So first of all, what is biblical inerrancy? Of course, it depends who you ask, right? But I think a very common view for those who define themselves as biblical inerrantists, and I will say that I do define myself as a biblical inerrantist of sorts. But what I do is I define inerrancy with respect to the authorial intentions of the divine author, and making the additional point that the authorial intentions of the divine author are not always identical by any means with the human author. So in other words, God may be doing something different in the text than what the human author thought God was doing. And so what the human author is doing could in fact be in error to some degree, even though what God is doing in that same text is without error. That's how I define biblical inerrancy. It's not how many people define it, however. And so I want to focus on those individuals. They define biblical inerrancy by ascribing the lack of error to any propositional affirmation made by any human author or editor of Scripture. So if this author believes X and says X with the intent that you believe X, then it follows that X is true. Because all such propositional affirmations within Scripture must be without error. And of course, a defeater or an objection to that claim would be to define or identify claims in the Bible that are in fact errant. They are in error, and yet they were affirmed by the biblical authors. An obvious example of this, and certainly there are no shortage of such examples, but one obvious example would be in Joshua 10, where we read that God acted to help the Israelites defeat the Amorites. And so we read Joshua declaring, "Sun, stand still over Gibeon." This is starting in verse 12 of Joshua 10. "Sun, stand still over Gibeon, and you moon over the valley of Ajalon." So the sun stood still and the moon stopped till the nation avenged itself on its enemies. So here the author is apparently recording and affirming as accurate what Joshua says, which is that God made the sun stand still and he made the moon stand still. And the problem here is, well, one problem is that today we believe that in fact the earth is not the fixed center of the universe, and that the sun and moon, well, the sun does not orbit around the earth, but rather the earth orbits around the sun. So assuming that the phenomenology of this event actually occurred, that it actually occurred historically as is described here, it would still be the case that God did not in fact make the sun stand still. He made the earth stand still. And so the text then would be in error to that degree, because the human author believed that God made the sun stand still, but he did not. Now the inerrantist, the kind that I'm disagreeing with, the one that ascribes inerrancy always to the human authorial statements, propositional affirmations, they defend inerrancy on their understanding here, often by saying, this is simply a phenomenological description. And then they will say, well, today we in fact say that, the sun is setting, but we don't literally mean the sun is setting. Right? And we say the sun is rising in the east, but we don't literally mean the sun is rising. And so in the same way, we can interpret this phenomenologically. Now, I hope that the problem with that is obvious. If not, we should make sure that we understand it's obvious. The problem is that the human authors at this time did not understand this as simply phenomenological language. They understood it as literal language. If I look out the window right now and I see a cloud moving across the sky, and I say, look at that cloud moving across the sky, I'm not speaking phenomenologically only, I'm speaking literally. I believe there is a cloud, an object in the sky that is moving across the sky. And the ancient Near Eastern people of the era in which the Israelites are writing and this text was formed, and that it describes these alleged events, they likewise, when they looked up at the sky and they saw what appeared to be the sun moving across the sky, albeit much more slowly than the cloud, they would likewise describe it literally. They believed the sun was moving across the sky. So to describe it as merely phenomenological language, I think, is at best disingenuous or self-deceived. It certainly is not true. I mean, literally, it is not true. This, even if the text describes past historical events, those events relay events in which God made the earth stand still, not the sun. Now, what that means, how we then explain that is to say, okay, so what is going on here is what we call accommodation. And accommodation means that God adapts to the thought forms, the understanding, and the limited knowledge of the receptor group, the group that what he wants to reach out to, that he wants to communicate to. That if they have some degree of limited knowledge, misunderstanding, he adapts to that and meets them where they are at and communicates to them in terms that they can understand. So if they were geocentrists and they believed the earth was the fixed center of the universe rather than the sun, well, God adapted to that and he met them where they were at. But the fact that there is accommodation in the text, which I think there clearly is, nonetheless means that to some degree, where human authors did not realize that they were being accommodated to, that God was meeting them where they were at in their limited cognitive horizons, right? Their limited knowledge. That to that degree, they were in fact in error. They didn't understand, they didn't realize that the earth is in fact not geocentric. God accommodated to that understanding, but it is not in fact true. And that I think is a very good reason why rather than try to invoke really pained and simply incorrect attempts to explain what is clearly literally intended language, not just phenomenal language, to interpret that as mere phenomenology, that the Israelites merely thought the sun appeared as if it were moving, but it was not. Rather than to say that, which is just disingenuous at best, I think we just have to recognize that there is error to some degree in what the human authors write, because God was accommodating to their limited understanding at their time and place in history.